As we learned in the last lesson, data transfer objects, or DTOs, are useful in creating a bit of type safety within our application. DTOs let us create a definition for the shape of the data that's coming into the body of an API request. But we don't know who or what is calling these requests. How can we make sure the data that's coming in is in the correct shape, or if it's missing required fields? It's a common best practice for any backend to validate the correctness of data being sent into our applications, and it's even more ideal if we can automatically validate these incoming requests. Nest.js provides the validation pipe to solve this exact problem. The validation pipe provides a convenient way of enforcing validation rules for all incoming client payloads. You can specify these rules by using a simple annotation in your DTO. Before we start using it, let's set up our entire application to use the validation pipe. Let's open up our main TS file and add the following line: app.useGlobalPipes, and let's pass in new validation pipe, making sure to import it from nest.js/common. Note that there are many other ways of binding global pipes that we'll dive into in later chapters. Next, we're going to have to install two packages, so let's fire up our terminal and enter in npm I class-validator and secondly class-transformer. We'll be continuing ahead as we already have these installed, but if you're following along, just pause the video and come back when it's finished. With everything installed and our validation pipe in place, we can start adding validation rules to our DTO now. Let's open up our Create Coffee DTO. Since most of the items here are strings, let's start by importing isString from class validator. Now, let's add a isString decorator before the name and brand properties, making them required. For flavors, let's use isString with an object of each set to true. Each true indicates that the expected value is an array of strings. Class Validator has a lot of other great options. Make sure to check out the documentation for lots of other great available decorators. So how do these decorators help us? Well, we can see that with the help of Class Validator, we've given instructions for our DTO and set up rules for things like what is required and what type do we expect certain properties to be. Now that we have these validation rules in place, if a request hits our endpoint with an invalid property in the request body, the application will automatically respond with a 400 bad request code, giving us automatic feedback and a way to test our payloads effortlessly. Let's test how these validation rules work by passing in a few different key values and see how our endpoint reacts. First, let's call the post/coffees endpoint, set our body to JSON, and enter in something like name shipwreck roast. It looks like it worked. Our API responded with a 400 bad request, and it even gave us a message array letting us know exactly what was wrong with each one of our fields. Our API knew that brand must be a string and flavors an array of strings. We didn't pass in either one of these with our request, but we can see that it was expecting them in our payload. Next, let's make another request, but this time, let's pass in two additional properties. First, let's pass in brand and enter in a random string for the value, let's say Buddy Brew. Secondly, let's pass in flavors, but for the value, let's pass in an array of numbers and see how our API reacts this time. Once again, the validation we set up works perfectly, and we can see that each value of flavors does in fact need to be a string, and we got an error message letting us know just that. Let's remove those numbers and add a random string flavor like caramel, for example, hit send, and there we go. Our validation finally passed, and we can see we got a 201 created response back. Alright, so now that we've seen how the basics of validation work, let's circle back to our update coffee DTO. If you remember when we created this DTO, we had to copy the values from our create coffee DTO and change some of those properties. This is a bit of a redundant code smell, isn't it? Let's see what we could have done better and how Nest can help simplify this very common task. Nest.js provides several utility functions as part of the package nest.js/mapped-types. These functions help us quickly perform these types of common transformations. Back to our terminal, let's install the @nest.js/mapped-types package and see how we can utilize it in our code. We'll continue ahead as we already have this package installed, but if you're following along, just pause the video and come back when it's finished. Once finished, let's head over to our update coffee DTO and see how we could avoid all this redundant code. First, let's remove all of the code inside of our update coffee DTO and extend this class with a helper function called partial type. Let's make sure we import partial type from nest.js/mapped-types. Partial type is expecting a type to be passed inside of it. So let's pass in createCoffee DTO. This partial type function is really helpful because what it's doing for us is returning the type of the class we passed into it with all of the properties set to optional. And just like that, no more duplicate code. Partial type not only marks all of the fields as optional, but it also inherits all of the validation rules applied via decorators, as well as adds a single additional validation rule to each field, that is optional rule on the fly. Let's save our changes, wait for the compilation to finish, and head over to Insomnia to test this out. Since all properties are labeled as optional now, thanks to Nest's map-types package, let's make a patch request to coffee/1 and remove everything but the name key value in our request payload. Great, it worked just like we wanted. You can see we got a 200 OK response back and no validation errors for the missing properties. If we try to pass in something incorrect such as a number or a boolean for name, we'll see that update coffee DTO really did inherit all the validation rules as we get a 400 bad request error here as well.